Hello, hello. Welcome back. I am Laura, your go to source for diverse storytelling in fashion, and I'm thrilled to be here for a new podcast episode after a very, very long time. Today, I will be doing something that I promised for way too long, and it's reviewing this book titled Fashion Education, edited by Ben Berry and Deborah and Christel. It has, I think it's 17 chapters written by different fashion educators on how to basically redress the entire education system around fashion and create a systemic revolution. Have you ever imagined fashion being as diverse as human culture? Have you ever dreamed of a respectful, ethical, and socially just fashion industry? Have you ever envisioned sustainability being at the core of the entire fashion system? This is your host, Laura Beltrán-Rubio. I'm a fashion curator, researcher, and educator. My mission is to translate scholarly insights into actionable strategies that we can all take to reshape how we create, wear, and think about fashion. So find a comfortable seat, brew some tea, and open your notebook as you join me in the quest for redressing fashion. I've been wanting to review this book for probably over a year now. In fact, I received it, I want to say a little over a year ago. Intellect, the publisher, sent it to me precisely so that I could review it. And then I just got busy with life and it never happened. But then I also think there's no better moment to actually review this book than now. I've read it a few times already. I read it for the first time soon after it arrived for my now defunct book club. And then I've kind of gone back to different chapters at different moments. And then I reread the entire thing from back to back over the past couple weeks in order to prepare for the review. So I'm very excited about it. And then the other thing is that I am now in the middle of final week in my institution. And so that basically means that I am drowning with work, but also at the same time, very inspired by the final results produced by my students. And so that makes me hopeful in the fashion education system. Although, if you have been following the news, both in the US and in the UK, and I guess elsewhere, academia is kind of in crisis these days. And there's a lot to be said about the future of academia. But I don't want to start on a downer. So let's focus on the positive first. And it's how inspired I am by this book. Before moving into the details of why this is so, I do want to make a couple of disclaimers. First one, I already mentioned it. This copy was sent to me by Intellect, the publishers of the book, so that I could review it. This is something that happens quite often, so it should not hinder my capacity to review the book, but I thought I should mention that. And then the other thing is that I know and have admired for several years Ben Berry, one of the book editors, and then a few of the people who wrote chapters for this book. So again, that will, I suppose, impact how I talk about this book, but then also it impacted how I received the book when I was reading it. This is probably the best moment to say that objectivity is made up and doesn't really exist. It's something that I guess Western academics at some point decided that was going to be the standard in academia and science and just research in general. But it doesn't really exist. So, there's that. But that's a topic for another day, so I'll stop there. Okay, so let's go back into the book. So, just to share a little bit of what it is about, I'm just going to read the summary and the back of the book as a sort of context for what the book is meant to be about. And it says, how fashion education can help create a more inclusive society. Despite the hard earned successes of body positive, anti racist, and disability rights activists calling for diverse representation, the fashion industry has been slow to evolve. In fashion education, the systemic revolution, fashion educators share their experiences navigating, resisting, and transforming the narrow beauty and body ideals that have defined pedagogy within the discipline. The chapters examine their challenges and successes, as well as practical strategies for countering narrow fashion education curriculums. Educators share ways to radically redesign courses and decenter white supremacy, fat phobia, ableism, transphobia, and misogyny. Together, the chapters illuminate the critical role of fashion education in systematically eliminating body oppression and building a more inclusive profession. And I must say that this is kind of aimed at different professions that can exist within fashion, including not just design, but also communications, even production of shows, runway shows, catwalks, but also exhibitions and other spaces within the industry. And so, one of the things that I really, really liked about the book is how diverse it really is in perspectives. It brings together 17 chapters, which offer, I would say, much more than 17 perspectives. Because even though even chapter is a sort of case study for a specific class in the set of strategies incorporated into that class by the different people who taught it, some of these classes were actually co-taught by several professors. Some of them also involved students in the design of the classes, which I personally think is one of the keys to actually achieving a really good and impactful education. And then also many of the chapters include the voices of the students, whether as co-authors of the chapters or as quotes from conversations with students or even feedback that students gave at different points of the course design, including some surveys that were filled after the course was completed. The other thing that I found really interesting is that the diverse points of view that were included in the book show different approaches to what inclusivity and diversity can mean within fashion. So there are some chapters that focus on, for example, queerness and achieving more visibility and I guess a more nuanced representation of what queerness is in fashion and in fashion education. There are some of them that focus on blackness. There are different body sizes. There are, I think, 2 or maybe 3 chapters dedicated to fatness specifically. There's one on mannequins and pattern cutting and how these usually reflect the sort of standard body shape and beauty ideals, which are, by the way, white and Eurocentric in the fashion industry. And so, how to challenge those. And then there's one chapter by actually one of my favorite scholars on indigenous fashion and indigenous fashion education, which actually is super inspiring to me, even beyond education and beyond my role as an educator, because it does include perspectives on positionality and introductions, how we talk about ourselves, how we relate to other people, and how we relate very especially to the land and the places that we are at, which is something that I'm constantly thinking about, especially since I moved from the so-called Americas to the UK. That has certainly shifted transformed my relationship with the land, but then also with people who live here as well. And so I found that chapter very interesting. Not just for that, but the introduction specifically, I think, touched me in that sense. Actually, while I'm speaking about that chapter, one of the quotes that I highlighted that it goes beyond fashion education, but it should be at the center of fashion education as well, is something that I'm very aligned with. You've heard me talk about it here, and it says, decolonization must be recognized and understood as an expressly material process that involves financial reparations and the return of stolen and occupied indigenous land at a minimum. Decolonized fashion education should look like a Bush school, and it should be grounded in land-based epistemologies, is basically what Riley Kuchran, who wrote this chapter, says. And so inevitably, I think about positionality, about location, and then also about sustainability, which is one of the aspects that maybe was a little lacking in this book. But at the same time, I want to say that a lot of people do think about sustainability more in environmental aspects rather than cultural and social and even educational aspects. So I don't blame them. I do think that a lot of what's going on and what they are saying in this book is actually related to sustainability in different ways. So, even if the word is not there, even if there's not one chapter dedicated to it, I'm still taking a lot of it away. The other chapter that I think I read more than once and probably stopped to cry more than once around is the chapter by Lauren Downing Peters on theorizing fat oppression. And the reason why this chapter touched me so much was because she writes about education as activism, which is also something that perfectly aligns with how I view education. But then also she writes about theory in relation to practice and theory in relation to education in a way that I think just puts together so many ideas so clearly that it made me see my own engagement with fashion theory and with fashion history in a different way. And I've written about this in my blog and my newsletter several times. I think one of my biggest struggles as an educator is that I tend to teach a lot of classes on history and theory of fashion to practice-based design students, or nowadays mostly fashion and communication students, some fashion buying, some fashion business students as well. And they tend to see history as this kind of nostalgic approach to the figures that they love, who in Britain tend to be Vivienne Westwood and people like her, which nothing against her. She's a major industry maker, a major figure in the fashion and the history of fashion in general. But we kind of forget about all of the other people who have also shaped the industry, including, of course, workers at different levels and in different parts of the world. Anyway, going back to what it means to teach fashion history and theory to practice-based students, I think that they usually undermine the value of theory and even of context to their own professional practices and to, I guess, the power that they could have in actually reframing the industry and transforming it into something much more inclusive and diverse and sustainable and socially just. And I guess truly global rather than extractive, where, the big fashion centers and people in the big fashion centers basically take out resources and knowledge and other stuff from formerly colonized countries, or what some prefer to call the developing world. And so I highlighted, you might be able to see some of it if you're watching the video, pretty much all of Lauren's chapter. There were so many things that just spoke to me, but there is one fragment in particular that I would like to read because this is one of my big takeaways about fashion theory and teaching fashion theory, especially in relation to building a better, more revolutionary, I guess, fashion education system and just fashion system in general. And it's where she introduces theory as liberatory practice based on the framework proposed by Bell Hooks. Lauren Downing Peters says, in theory as liberatory practice, Hooks argues that theory is actually a necessary practice within a holistic framework of liberatory activism. She explains how theory can be a healing practice for students, one that enables introspection, self-recovery, collective liberation, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to imagine different futures. Part of the reason theorizing can be intimidating is that it requires one to cast off old ways of thinking and to question established social norms. On the one hand, this is decidedly uncomfortable work. On the other, theorizing can be a joyful practice that is not entirely antithetical to the practice of fashioning itself. And so, this joy of theorizing and the possibility, perhaps the freedom that theorizing offers us to imagine alternative worlds, is something that I am inspired by, and actually that I've been trying to put into practice with my students over the past year or so, where I've been asking them not just to engage with theory in a sense of understanding or trying to understand what it means, trying to see or look at historical examples of how this theory maybe applies or doesn't, or more or less applies. But then also, how can we move that, or how can we take that into creative practices and devise a completely different future? Actually, during pre-final reviews last week, what we call formative reviews here, well, I guess in my institution, I don't know if this is a UK standard term, but I could see how some of the students were taking some of the ideas that we had discussed in class about fashion and politics, about image making, about agency, and even taking cues from Afrofuturism specifically to apply them in their own imagination of different futures, whether it's in response to queer identities and queer activism, or migrant experiences, especially from the Southeast Asian diaspora, having moved to different parts of the world and eventually landing in the UK. Now that I'm thinking about it, I would love to maybe have some of those students share their experience in some other podcast episode. So I'll see if I can make that happen. But for now, I think, yeah, I was really, really inspired by this. And then in general, I think there were a lot of different examples and calls to action made in the different chapters that I think are very useful for fashion educators, and I would say for fashion students as well. But this leads me, however, to one of the things that I would say is maybe one of the limitations of the book, and it's that it's definitely very oriented towards education. In the summary that I read, we can see that it was developed and visioned from the beginning, probably as something that's intended for educators to read. And so, my question is, who are the educators that are actually reading this book? Because I'm not really sure that people who just work in fashion academia and teach a bunch of different things related to fashion are necessarily going to be drawn to this book or know that it exists, because that's the other thing I think with academic presses and with academic writing in general. We should know that the kind of general attention that they receive from the masses is close to none. Only a very specialist kind of niche public gets or is aware of the existence of books like this. And so that limits the readership from the beginning. And then the other thing, and it's precisely because of its title and its purpose, mission, I'm not really sure that the average fashion educator will be drawn to this book. I want to say that it's mostly the people who are interested in doing the hard work of transforming the fashion industry through education that are going to be drawn to it. And that sadly means that its impact, it's probably going to be limited. And then actually that leads me to some of the reflections that some of the authors write about. Many of them share their experiences of teaching these kind of revolutionary curricula or syllabi, programs, courses, whatever we want to call them. Many of them are electives. Many of them are also offered a little bit as a sort of revolution against what most of the people in the department of faculty to which these educators belong. And so if they're facing opposition internally, that means that not a lot of people will even align with these practices and probably wouldn't even welcome reading a chapter about that course that they don't like or don't think is necessary. Because that's the other thing. I think the status quo in fashion and in everything, I would say, is held so strongly that it's just very, very difficult to even convince people that this work is needed because they don't see like anything is missing. And that, of course, is because we are all blinded by our own visions and privileges. So, yeah, I think that's one of the sad sides of it to me. But hopefully, my audience is not very big, but hopefully this will get to new people. If you haven't read the book, I really recommend it. If you are interested in fashion education and are an educator, a student in fashion and other creative industries, I think this is a really, really good example with a lot of gems inside it. The other thing, going back to, I think, the limitations of the book, is that even beyond the limited audience that this is intended for, and assuming that the people who read the book are inspired by it, like me, and are interested in taking action and manage to actually apply some of the calls to action laid out in the book and some of the strategies, and maybe adapt some of the examples that are written about in the book, and start teaching using them or incorporating some of the insights from the book and strategies from the book. I'm wondering if the reach will also be limited. And the reason I'm saying this is because we all have students that get very engaged and very inspired with how we teach, but then a lot of students don't. And then also what happens with all of the students that simply don't pass through our classes. Not passes in getting a grade to pass, but that we don't meet in our class. And if students are just getting a regular, very hegemonic, very ableist and centered in whiteness and just normative fashion education, then there's little hope, I think, to changing both education and the industry because we do tend to repeat a lot of our experiences. And, we tend to teach how we were taught in many ways. And it does require a lot of like questioning and studying and experimenting and freedom to do so within our institutions to be able to actually change things. The good thing is that we do see a lot of testimonies from students in this book who have gone out into the world, into the industry, and taken different roles there. And now they are applying a lot of the things that they learned thanks to these superstar educators. So that's also inspiring. And hopefully, from their own places within the industry, they can also exert change. And I do believe that movements and activism and action and change, especially systemic change, needs just a few people to get it started. And then change starts kind of snowballing and transformation happens. Or I don't know, I'm feeling a little too romantic today, maybe, and I'm choosing to focus on this positive side, I hope. One last thing I want to say, one of the downers, actually two, of or missed opportunities, maybe, of the book, two of them. One, and I'm only saying this because I'm a very picky editor and I have been editing stuff for a very long time. Writing, like grammar, full stops, having full sentences could have been improved. Although I do realize, because I have worked with many different authors who have varied writing experiences and abilities as well, that it is very difficult to have consistent writing in a book with so many authors. So I understand the difficulties of it. But yeah, there were some parts where I was like, oh, not really sure I'm getting the entire idea. This could have been better written. But I also understand how difficult it is to actually have that. And the second thing, and you probably know this is coming if you've read the book, I don't see Latin America here. And I very, very much would have liked to have something about Latin America here. There are very few of us specializing in Latin America who hold permanent positions in higher education or in academic institutions, but there are a few of us. And then the other thing, I guess, is Latin America and Latin American studies tend to be or have tended to be also very white and hegemonic in our own very problematic way. So I wonder if that's part of the issue, but I would have liked to see a little bit about how we teach through these complexities of being Latino in US and UK and like English speaking institutions, which is what the book focused about. Now, I would also like to see a more global approach to fashion education and generating a systemic revolution through education and perhaps even also decolonizing education as well. So I don't know. This, I guess, is also inspiring because that means there's still a lot of work to do. I would be excited to maybe even contribute with some of that as well. So hit me up if you're interested in working together to provide that. And then that also leads me to two more books that I ordered because you know that I can always find more things to read, even though I don't really have the time to do it or the brain. But I found this, it's actually a magazine issue. It's called Radical Pedagogy. It's a special issue of Modes of Criticism. And this one offers additional ideas on radical pedagogies. I think it's not exclusive to fashion or maybe not even the arts, but it does have some articles that relate to fashion and the creative industries. And then the other one is this radical fashion exercises, which I think is not necessarily education focused, but it links to education because it is about different exercises that can help reshape how we look at fashion and how we create fashion. So I'm hoping to be able to read them probably over the summer and maybe share some other ideas and strategies that I can maybe devise from these soon. The last thing that just popped up in my mind, and again, if anyone's interested, I would very much look forward to see if we can make it happen. If anyone's interested in having a sort of maybe workshop or something on how to revolutionize fashion education or just education in the arts, the creative industries, maybe even see if we can bring some of these authors together to do it, I would love to do that. So, to wrap up, I know I didn't offer you a summary of the book. That was not my intention. I wanted to share my thoughts about the usefulness and the potential impact of this book. And I hope I have convinced you or shown you how useful this book can be if you want to, I guess, be the change you want to be in the world, however cheesy that may sound. And you are in any way interested in fashion education, whether because you are an educator, whether because you're a student or you are just considering learning more about fashion and how to create fashion and spread the world and I guess tell different stories about fashion and share strategies of how to create fashion. This book is really, really helpful. It's really inspiring. It has a lot of resources, a lot of good examples, a lot of calls to action. And even though I've already read it like 3 times, I'm definitely excited to go back into some of the chapters that I feel are more relevant to my teaching, and probably even the ones that are not, as I take a break from teaching this summer and start planning what's coming next for the next academic year. Special thanks to Intellect for sending this gem my way. I have really enjoyed reading it and learning from it. And many, many thanks and much admiration to all of the writers in the book and the editors. especially. I will be back talking about fashion education, not in academia, but in public facing spheres very soon with a guest that I love and admire and have had the honor to work with her and collaborate with her for several years now in just a few weeks. So please stay tuned. And I also have some other exciting conversations lined up. So please come back. As always, thank you. Thank you for being here, for listening me ramble about a bunch of things related to fashion. I hope to bring some more applicable insights next time. And as always, if you like this, please follow the show, like it, leave a comment, share it with your friends. It does help me a lot to spread the word and just keep sharing diverse stories of global fashion. Until next time.